Neoliberalism and neoconservatism, what are they and how does Trump fit in? Now, if you listen to a lot of people on the internet, you'd think neocons are pretty much everywhere. But are they using the term correctly? The first thing to understand in terms of neoliberalism or neoconservatism, although these terms use as a root, if that's properly a root, liberal and conservative as part of their descriptor, they are not what the average person understands as liberal or conservative. Neo is Greek for new or young. Tacking neo in front of liberal or conservative is meant to highlight that it is an altering of the original form of the use and philosophy. Now, that they claim the same roots as these philosophies of the original words, but they are significantly different enough to warrant a labeling change. Or, in other words, liberalism to neoliberalism is a relationship, but they're not synonymous. The same thing for conservative to neoconservative. They have a shared heritage. Now, neoliberalism is an idea that formed and developed after World War II. The idea was for the US to foster international organizations and create multilateral partnerships to advance a form of American style progressivism to the world. Neoconservatism formed from disillusioned progressives who thought 60s counterculturalism and the anti war sentiment had gone too far. Neoconservatism looks to use international organizations and create multilateral partnerships to advance democracies around the world in the American mold. Now, they sound very much alike because they are very much alike. They are both parts of our establishment, and their goals overlap almost 90% of the time. Where they differ is primarily in methodology. But even though their methodology or their chosen methodology differs, they often carry forward with each other's ideas. If one side started something, the other side often finishes it. Um, Neoliberals and neoconservatives are not combined to any single party. Neoliberals tend to be the same thing as progressives, but not always. Neocons concentrate in whatever party they see as being the best able to advance their goals. Neocons drifted out of the Democratic Party and into the GOP. Neocons despise Trump more than they do Democrats, or I say most Democrats. So, how do neoliberals and neocons differ domestically? Once again, they're very similar. Neoliberals champion progressivism at home. Neocons are fine with any policy, including progressive ones, as long as they see it as promoting domestic stability. Now, if anyone's interested into getting the domestic part of it, I can do some digging and we can make another video at another time. I wanted to concentrate on the foreign part, foreign policy part of the two camps because that's how most people use it. Neoliberals favor soft power to push countries into international agreements and organizations, and they assume that the interaction between these countries and these global organizations will bring about liberalization, uh, i.e., like China. Neocons would prefer to use military force, either ours or some faction of ours that we've armed fully to the teeth in order to install American style democratic governments. Neoliberals very much dislike national identity. They see it getting in the way of their global order. And they hope to dissolve nationalities into this global order as a new identity. They're hoping that the global order will become more important than nations themselves. Neocons are accepting of national entities as long as they are subservient to the US. Prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, neocons tolerated dictators. Since then, they favor their overthrow. Now, Gulf War II provides our first illustration of contrasts. For nearly a decade following the first Gulf War, the US performed a decade long program of embargo, sanctions, and very limited airstrikes on Iraq. All the while, the US negotiated with the countries of the Middle East and Europe to put diplomatic and economic pressure on Iraq to get it to adopt a new form of government. The neocons agitated that same entire decade to go to war with Iraq. They didn't even really need a good reason. They were just waiting for the reason to happen. When they finally got their wish and went into Iraq, they went in with hardly any world support because they don't really care about having everybody in the big kumbaya circle the same way the neoliberals do. The goal of the neocons was to establish a democracy. It instead broke the country completely. Now, Trump himself has gone on record as saying that war was incredibly stupid. So, what happened in Syria also gives us some insight. The Arab Spring color style revolutions were a neoliberal supported move. The results in Syria and Libya appear to be unintended consequences. Neocons pushed for harder interventions in both countries to take advantage of the power vacuum. The neoliberal response was to balance the forces in those countries in order to allow organic solutions to work out with the factions in both regions. Now, during Trump's administration, he performed a single airstrike in response to, let's call it, an alleged chemical attack. This attack was very limited and had very much no impact on the stability of the Assad regime. The airbase that was struck was actually operational within the hour. So the point being is Trump was sending a message, but he wasn't actually trying to change the landscape of the country. He was just trying to change a behavior. The neocons wanted Assad's regime destroyed. And during Obama's administration, when something similar happened, another alleged chemical attack, Obama did nothing. So this kind of illustrates the difference between the three groups. Whereas Obama did nothing, Trump essentially made a attack that was essentially a gesture, and the neocons were basically screaming the entire time for the Assad regime to be taken down. The war with ISIS is also a good illustration. Neoliberals opted to build new organizations and alliances on the ground. The idea was to slowly root ISIS out with organic forces that would have long term staying power once the ISIS operation was complete. Uh, Trump set the military on them and took them out in a few weeks, meaning Obama could have done that as well. But from the neoliberal perspective, that was the wrong way to do it. Now, once ISIS was taken out, the neocons were screaming for the bombing campaign to be expanded to take out both Hezbollah and Assad. Now, Ukraine's a bit more interesting. The various pushes to bring Ukraine into NATO were neocon in nature, as they would have resulted in direct confrontation with Russia. Neoliberals pushed the color revolutions and worked to slowly drift Ukraine into European organizations to try to create a negotiation point for Ukraine's NATO entry. Victoria Nuland, who was the ambassador to Ukraine during the Maiden Revolution, Euro Maiden Revolution, uh, blatant support of overthrowing the Ukrainian government is pretty much a nexus point where neocons and neoliberals ended up meeting, maybe not fully intentionally. Presumably, both neocons and neoliberals saw this as serviceable, meaning that uh, facilitating the overthrow of the country was something both of them were okay and could live with. The annexing of Crimea by Russia and the separatist Russian speakers rebelling seems to not have been anticipated. The US had a very neoliberal response to both these situations by employing modest sanctions, diplomacy, military training, and covert military and intelligence advisors. Having Germany handle the Minsk II negotiations was also very neoliberal in nature. When the actual Russian invasion came, the reactions to the invasion were a fusion of neoliberal and neocon ideas. The idea of drawing lines of support that could not be crossed was very neoliberal. Violating those lines as they failed to create worse tension were neocon. And I mean the lines essentially as we gave Ukraine access to longer and longer range weapons. Each one saying, well, we can't cross the line because if we do, we might push Russia too far. So we were watching an out in the open tug of war between neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Now, Trump is unilaterally negotiating an end to the war. Uh, Neoliberals might back something like this, but they would demand that as much of the rest of the world's organizations be involved, especially Europe and the UN and NATO, whereas Trump just basically goes out and does it on his own with his administration. Now, Israel is probably the most complicated of the neocon, neoliberal, and Trumpian definitions. There is a tendency to call anyone who's an Israel supporter a neocon. Neocons do back Israel, but they don't do it for religious reasons, nor do they think it's the promised land. They look at Israel as a Western island surrounded by a hostile Arab Sea. Neocons will generally back anything that improves the security of Israel. This creates confusion as there's groups who I'd call Israel firsters, who are people who think of Israel in equal terms to the United States, or might even consider it to be a more important issue than the United States. And then there are the people I call the greater Israel proponents out there. Those are the people who would like to see Israel expand to biblical proportions, areas that were uh, alluded to in the Bible as being part of the original Israeli nation. Okay? Often, a war in the region, an airstrike, or a redrawing of borders ends up benefiting Israel because it's often the opposite side of whatever else is going on there. It's been more common that something going in the Middle East involves somebody else in Israel versus somebody else and somebody else. Now, because these various things that happen, a redrawing of a border, an airstrike, or a war, ends up benefiting Israel, it doesn't mean the neocons, firsters, and greater Israel proponents all have the same goal. The best way to differentiate the groups is to look at the Iraq War. A greater Israel supporter would have looked at the Second Iraq War as an opportunity to demolish Iraq and create an opening for Israel to occupy one third of Iraq, which is rightfully theirs. An Israel firster would be happy in any effect that diminishes Iraq's military capabilities. A neocon would say diminishing Iraq's military capabilities for a secure Israel is a first good step, but occupying Iraq and turning it into a Western democracy is the ultimate goal. So for the neocons, Israel being secure is not the end goal in the Middle East. It's just one of many goals. Whereas they want to see democratic governments spread across the entire region. The neoliberal view on Israel was always a grander view of the Middle East. Israel, in that grand view, is a problem child, and you just can't make it go away. So the neoliberals always had to try to find a way to make it play well with others. The neoliberal view accepted Middle East authoritarianism when it acted as a bulwark against Soviet communism. This tolerance disappeared with the fall of the USSR. Neoliberalism looked at the two-state solution in Israel as the lever to keep Israel hobbled while trying to convince Arabs that the West wanted what they wanted. Neocons have always hated the two-state solution as being bad for Israel's security. In the current Middle East, we now have the problem that the Arab states are all very weak. Israel's ability to project power far beyond its border drops off rapidly the further you go away, and really couldn't be a counter to a true Iranian push. If the Iranians really tried to sweep into the region, Israel could do a lot of damage to such an advance, but they probably couldn't stop it, short of nukes, which would probably happen. The neoliberal bent has always been to try to use diplomacy, sanctions, and economic incentives to try to bring Iran into the global order and thus pacify the Middle East, all the while hobbling Israel with the two-state solution. Iran has proved highly resilient to such attempts. The first Trump administration's foray into the Middle East was the Abraham Accords. This was a bold idea to accept the idea that Iran was incapable of being shaped by outside pressure and would remain a power hostile to the Arab Middle East. The second part of the Accords was an idea to fuse together an Arab-Israeli partnership that was both economic and military as a counter to Iran. The idea would be to stabilize the Middle East with an improving economic bloc and create a military alliance using Egyptian manpower, oil state Arab money, and Israeli technical expertise as a counter to Iran. This new arrangement would be one that would need a lot less involvement from the United States, that being a very Trumpian move. The idea of being less involved in the region makes both neoliberals and neoconservatives shudder with fear. Now, the last part of Trump's Abraham Accords was a plan to essentially buy out the Palestinians. They would recognize most Israeli gains as permanent. They would add the Negev desert to Palestinian control and essentially develop Palestinian areas with massive capital from around the world. They would then become a much wealthier sub-state of Israel with greater autonomy, but not true independence. This is a solution that both the neoliberals and neocons despised. The Palestinians also absolutely despised this idea and rejected the offer. Well, it was a good thing they'd never have to deal with Trump again. Oops. During the Biden administration, essentially Biden pivoted towards, once again, trying to sweet talk Iran and at the same time reluctantly slow rolled the Abraham Accords because they will continue with something if they see it in the neoliberal interest. And it was basically countries coming together, organizing, and trying to create a new group. But they didn't push it hard because they didn't want it to essentially freak out Iran. However, the fact that the Abraham Accords kept rolling forward caused Iran to take a very dim view to what Biden was doing. even though Biden's administration wasn't very enthusiastic about the Abraham Accords. The October 7th Hamas attacks were a direct attempt by Iran to derail the Accords, as several Arab countries were about to sign on in October, November, and December. The attempt to have Hezbollah pile on Israel and then the lame missile attacks on Israel by Iran ended up blowing up in Iran's face in a truly spectacular manner that probably no one predicted. It allowed Israel to completely outmaneuver the neoliberals and militarily destroy Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as humiliate Iran at the same time. Worse, it opened up the door to potentially dismantle and occupy parts, if not all, of Gaza, something neocons would approve of. But they wouldn't be happy with that because it still left Iran out there. They would much prefer that Israel be given a free hand to take out Gaza and Iran at the same time. In the waning days of the Biden administration, Assad in Syria collapsed. This was much more unintended consequences than a plan. Assad was highly dependent on two things: Russia and Hezbollah, both of which stepped in regularly to assist Assad when his faction was getting into trouble and being pressed too hard by the other factions. Russia's commitments to Ukraine forced it to cut back on support. Israel's attacks on Hezbollah forced Hezbollah to go into survival mode. Without these supports, essentially the enemies of Assad were able to press him hard and Assad fell. Now, this made neocons happy, but it wasn't really anybody's plan. So, are there neocons in Trump's administration? Yes. And the reason they're there is, one, they're experienced with a lot of this stuff. Two, they're far more likely to help with the Abraham Accords than the neoliberals would. Keeping the neocons in the administration on a short leash, especially in terms of Iran, is critical. Because they're not going to be happy with that one item. They want the whole shebang. Specifically, in Iran, it's either crippled or occupied or sitting with a democratic government, which is really improbable. So, with Assad fallen in Syria, expect to see a slow jockeying for position that neoliberals would support. However, if anything occurs in Syria that threatens the Abraham Accords, expect quick, brutal airstrikes. These are going to happen to shore up the Abraham Accords, not to create regime change and democratization like the neocons want. Expect to see Gaza continue to be pummeled. Now, there's a chance Trump may put his original offer to the Palestinians back on the table. Likely, everybody is looking for some form of total capitulation out of the Palestinians there. However, never assume that Trump's threat to move them all out and develop the area is a bluff. It may not be the goal he wants, but it doesn't seem like he bluffs. This whole thing going on with Gaza is essentially like a vat of boiling acid to the neoliberals. Neocons would love to see a Palestinian-free Gaza, but they hate anything short of that and despise the slow trajectory of the process. Neocons would like to bomb Iran. Currently, Trump is negotiating and may have just prevented a rogue Israeli airstrike on Iran. Now, looking at what happened is probably a good cop, bad cop negotiating ploy, with Israel being the bad cop. Neocons would love to see the democratization of Arab states. However, for the Abraham Accords to succeed, stable monarchies and single party states will be tolerated for the foreseeable future. What about the Houthis? Yemen is a problem area. The negotiations with Iran may be part of that solution. The Red Sea Strait has to remain open in order for global prices to stay low. The US is stuck with the security of this strait for the time being. At some point, Europe will likely be pushed to take over. However, right now, their ability to perform long distance operation is very limited. They only have a handful of ships that can do the job, and they don't have enough to basically do it at a year round capability, shuffling ships in and out of the region. And they also lack a lot of the specialized support equipment that only a massive bloated military like ours has. In the long term, the countries of the Abrahamic Accord might be the ultimate successors of security for the strait, but that's likely decades off. So let's sum this up. It's going to take negotiations, missile strikes, and airstrikes to secure the region for the local security forces before the US can begin the process of backing off. Every airstrike is not the neocons controlling the process. Often, these strikes are far less than what they would would desire or want to have happen. Okay, so in the comments, did I help you get a better idea of where neocons and neoliberals stand? Um, I like to pick on John Bolton because he's just obvious, because he is the walrus. But do you have other questions on how neoliberals and neocons look at things? Do you see areas where maybe I conflated them a little bit too much? Um, they are very close, but just different enough. Uh, Also, what do you think is going to be happening in the near future in the Middle East? Do you think my prognosis and description of events is going in that direction, or do you think something completely different is happening? If you do, why? Always interested in anyone's take on things. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, look at my other titles. You'll see things you like. Consider subscribing. And uh, if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.